Welcome back to another episode of From Prison to the Streets. I'm Eric. I did 11 years in prison, and I talk about prison stuff. Today, I'm actually going to be talking about my childhood a little bit. A viewer recently asked me what my childhood was like because they grew up in the country like me, but they were afraid of getting in trouble over stuff like smoking weed or drinking or whatever. So how does someone go from a small-town country boy to taking someone out in the woods and shooting them? Well, I'll tell you a little bit about my childhood, give you some context. Now, as a disclaimer, I don't blame my parents, my upbringing, or anyone else for what I did. I'm responsible for my actions. I take responsibility for it. So there you have it. This is the context of my home life when I was growing up, but this is not to put blame on anybody besides myself. I guess you could say, hold on, I got to take my glasses off. I'm sweating a little bit. I guess you could say that I had a troubled home life. And before I really talk about that too much, let me tell you a little bit about my parents. My father was born in 1941. He kind of grew up around Boston and, the New England area. And he was a big kid and he knew how to fight. He had his first kid probably at the age of 14 or 15 years old. I'm not really sure. My mom was my dad's seventh wife. But he was a big kid. He knew how to fight. And it didn't take long for him to get noticed by the wrong people. And he began collecting money for the mob. And eventually he became a sort of hired muscle for the mob. Now, he had a trucking company that he used as a front and stuff like that, but I'm not going to go into much more detail on that because, some of the people that my dad was associated with, well, those families are still active and stuff, and it's not my business to talk about their business. You got all these guys on YouTube that want to talk about how they were connected to the mob and connected to organized crime and connected to gangs and this, that, and the other. Let me tell you something. I know a lot about gangs and stuff. And I could tell you a little bit about what my dad was involved in. But here's the thing. If you actually know those people, it's probably a good idea to not talk too much about those people. And I'm not going to. That's why you don't see a lot about gangs on my channel. Now, my dad ended up in California. And he was a career criminal. Drug dealer, thief. He stole cars, beat people up for money. That was kind of my dad. He was a big guy, knew how to fight. He was a badass, And he ended up going to prison. And he did time in California. I think he might have done a little bit of time in Massachusetts, but that was before I was born. Now, my mother, she had a very bad home life. When she was a kid growing up, her dad was a very bad alcoholic and, popped pills like crazy. She was molested by some of her family members, and it did a number on her. Now, her dad would get real drunk, and he would take sleeping pills on top of it, and then he would beat the shit out of her. And she was living with her dad for a while, and it was so bad that she was afraid to go into the house when she came home from school. She would steal cans of food from the local grocery store, and she would come home and she would hide underneath her house, and she would sleep there and eat the canned food. And, that's how she spent her teenage years. Now, she ended up running with a rough crowd. Her father died, I think, when she was 17, I want to say, maybe before that. But she found her father dead in the bathroom. He had drank himself to death. But she ended up running with a rough crowd and became engaged to a Hell's Angel. So she was running around with the Hell's Angels, terrorizing stuff and so on. And my dad had business dealings with those people. So he met my mom, and eventually they got married. That, of course, was after she was no longer with the Hell's Angel guy that she was messing with. So these were my parents, and my dad wanted to get out of that lifestyle. So when he got out of prison and when I was born, he made a decision for whatever reason to come out to Kansas. And he wanted to leave that lifestyle and become legit. So he did. He came out here, started his own business. He had a trucking company and a shop. And this is where I grew up. I was born in Jackson, California, but I was raised out here. And this has been my home since, the early 90s. But these individuals, my parents, I love my parents to death. And I'm not trying to beat these people up. I'm not trying to talk bad about my parents. I love my parents. My dad's in the grave and my mom's still alive. God bless her. And I love them both. They didn't make the best decisions. They made some mistakes here and there. But when you think about how they grew up and the lifestyle they led, I can't expect them to be perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. For the first few years that we were in Kansas, everything was fine. Everything was really good. And I suppose it was about the time I started school that things got pretty bad. When I started kindergarten, around that time, my dad started having some very, very bad back problems. And we used to take him up to the VA up in Kansas City all the time to figure out what was wrong with his back. And to this day, I'm not exactly sure what was up with his back. They said it was Reiter's syndrome. They said it was, his vertebrae in his spine were actually closing around his spinal cord. And I don't know exactly what was wrong, but I know he had some serious back problems. And we would have to put this mattress in the back of our station wagon. We had an old Ford station wagon, and we would put a mattress in the back of it. And we would have to drive him around to different doctors to try to get him the help that he needed. They ended up putting him on a bunch of Oxycontin. And, it's a pretty heavy painkiller, and they gave him a lot of it. But it got to where he could walk around again, and he could be vertical, and he could work. So he had a shop, he had a trucking company, he was usually on the road. And my mom had very, very bad migraine headaches. And one day, my dad offered her one of his pain pills. And things were never the same. My mom became addicted to those pain pills. And it was really hard on her, and it was really hard on the family. Like, it was a bad addiction. She was in bed all the time. And it affected her mood and her personality as well. So she would steal my dad's pills all the time. And my dad would get into fights with her about it. My dad wasn't the nicest person sometimes. He could be very aggressive, very abrasive. Although I can say that he didn't really beat on her. There might have been a couple times when he hit her. But it wasn't a thing. My dad didn't like to hit women, he didn't believe in that. But they would fight about those pills all the time. And my mom would take off, threaten to commit suicide and stuff like that. And my dad would chase after her. We had this old Lincoln Town car with glass packs on it. And the thing was loud, it was mean, it was fast. My dad was a hell of a mechanic. But my mom would take off and she'd be running around town and my dad would be chasing her down in this big car. One time he hit her with the car right out in front of the house. And so I grew up seeing this stuff. And then when my dad would be away on the road, he would have to leave pain pills for my mom because she would go into withdrawals, And he couldn't just leave the pills with her because she could not, regulate herself. So my dad would leave the pills with us kids. And, I have two older sisters. One is 4 years older than me and the other is 5 years older than me. And he would leave the pills with us. And it started, he would leave the pills with my oldest sister, Shannon. And one time my mom wanted pills and she threw Shannon down the stairs. Like, the stairs in this house are steep. Shannon got thrown down the stairs, broke her collarbone. After that, my dad left the pills with me, and I had a safe in my room. And my mom broke into my safe, took the pills. And my mom was in bed all the time. So my dad was on the road, my mom was in bed, and it was just us kids. We kind of had to take care of ourselves. And I took care of my mom a lot. And I was always worried about what was going on at home. I was always afraid my mom was going to try to commit suicide or something like that. And I remember, oh man. I'm sorry, guys. This is hard for me to talk about. So I was so worried, and I needed to take care of my mom, and I started being homeschooled throughout junior high. So I was pretty much teaching myself because my mom was sick all the time, or comatose, one of the two. And I would be at home trying to take care of her. I'd bring her coffee, make her breakfast, whatever. I would pick up around the house here and there. And then I would go do my schoolwork by myself for about 3 hours. And when I was done with the schoolwork and my mom was taken care of, I'd go ride my bicycle around town. I live in a town of about 120 people. I didn't have a lot of friends. My family was from California, and we live in, Republican country. And, if you live in the Bible Belt or a very strong conservative area, if you're from California, they tend to think that you're the devil. Now, through all of this time, it's important to note there was a lot of physical abuse in the household. SRS, they call it DCF now, but SRS at the time was called out to my house multiple times about abuse. My sister's going to school with bruises on them, fat lips, black eyes. My dad was very physically abusive. My sister Jennifer got the worst of the abuse from my dad, and I think my sister Shannon got the worst of the abuse from my mom. So my dad would take off over the road, and one of my sisters would piss my mom off somehow. And, when you're addicted to drugs, sometimes your moods are all over the place. You can be real aggressive, and I'm not making excuses, and, whatever. I really don't like talking bad about people, and I don't want to seem like I'm talking bad about my mom because I love her to death. Anyway, my sisters would do something to piss my mom off, and then my mom would call my dad or talk to him on the payphone, which at one point my dad used payphones, and then later on when cell phones became more accessible, he had a cell phone. Anyway, while he was over the road, my mom would talk to him on the phone and tell my dad about how my sisters and sometimes myself were misbehaving and stuff. And so then my dad would come home from being over the road and he would beat the shit out of us. I mean, that's bottom line. And sometimes it was my mom. I remember my mom throwing rocks at my sister Jennifer. I remember one time she tied me up, beat the shit out of me. It was rough, man. We'll just say it was rough, Oh, man. By the time I was in high school, and when I got to high school, I actually went back to public school. I wasn't going to get beat up by my dad. That was something that I had, resolved was not going to happen. So I started fighting back. And me and my dad fought almost every day. We'd throw punches at each other. Sometimes there were knives pulled. Sometimes there were guns pulled. Me and my dad had some knockdown, drag 'em out fights. And, it wasn't cool. Now, all of us kids handled our home environment in a slightly different way. My sister Shannon, I guess she handled it the most normal way. She turned 18, she moved out, she went to college. She ended up getting pregnant and dropped out of college and wanted to raise her kid. And then she had more kids, and she's always handled the past probably better than any of us, honestly. Jennifer, the last year that she was at home, Shannon moved out a year before Jennifer did. Jennifer and I had always been very, very close growing up. And then that last year before she moved out, it was like she was a different person. You know, she would do her chores, try to avoid a beating from Dad, and then she would go upstairs and lock herself in a room. But she would go up there and she would lock herself in that room and read her Bible. That's all she did for the last year that she lived here. That's how she handled the problem. And then she went off to college, and she never looked back. After she went off to college, she did not come home very often, maybe once or twice a year. She did not call. I didn't talk to her much after that. Jennifer and I grew very distant. And right around that period, Shannon and I got very close. But Jennifer, she became very religious, and she has a strong church community around her, and that's how she dealt with that. You know, she went and forged a life for herself and distanced herself from the past, and I'm very proud of her for that. And Shannon built a family for herself and stuff. But when I was in high school, I was angry. I was fighting every single day. I wasn't getting beat up. I was fighting. Cops were called from time to time, and I was angry. I was bitter. And I guess the way I dealt with my problem, I would smoke weed and I would drink. Now, I can't say that I was a super bad kid or anything. I tried to do what was right. Sometimes I was rowdy and rambunctious. Sometimes I was downright an asshole. But I don't think I was a bad person. It's hard for me to look back at that and pass judgment on anyone in the situation. You know, I love my dad and I love my mom. And I know that of anyone on this planet, they've been harder on themselves, even before my dad passed away. So more than any criticism I could level at my mom, I know she's beat herself up enough about it, and I'm not going to beat her up about it. Today, I can proudly say that she's not on Oxycontin anymore. She has a good man in her life. She just got married, and her attitude is way better. She's way more positive now. She's in a much better place than she used to be, and I'm very proud of her. I'm sorry, guys. This is where I'm going to have to end the video, you know. I don't like talking about my childhood, but I hope this gives you all a little bit of context into how I grew up and the situation I was in when I did what I did, when I committed my crime. Like I said, this is not an excuse for what I did by any means, not an excuse. There's never a good excuse for taking matters into your own hands or ending somebody's life or hurting somebody. That ain't the way to be. You know, I did what I did. I'm responsible for it. And that's just how it is. I'm Eric. This has been another episode of From Prison to the Streets. I will see you all later. Right.